Let's talk about pronouns some more. What we've covered so far are the personal pronouns, I, you, he, she, it, and demonstrative pronouns, this, that, these, and those. Indefinite pronouns, all, some, most, those words, right? And we're going to take a look at some of the other ones. Let's look at number 4, relative pronouns. Relative pronouns are connecting words, okay? So the definition says it plays two parts at once. It is a pronoun and it is also a connective. It's a connective for the dependent clause and the main clause. Let's see. As a pronoun, it acts as a subject or object in a subordinate part of the sentence. All right, so it functions as a regular pronoun does. He would function as the subject of a sentence. Him would function as the object of a sentence. And the relative pronouns do the same thing. And relative pronouns, let me flip real quick, are the words that, who, and which that we're talking about. And who can change the form to whom. That's the difference of the nominative case versus the objective case. So it's only those three words really that we're talking about that are called relative pronouns. And so those words can function within the sentence, but in the dependent part of the sentence, dependent clause. So we'll see an example of that. As a connective, it says it joins the subordinate to a more important part of the sentence. So we're talking about the subordinate clause versus the main clause. And we put brackets around the subordinate clause. If it came first in the sentence, we usually put a comma there. Okay, so it's well, I guess it's a different kind of subordinate clause we'll end up with if we are using a relative pronoun. There's a different kind of structure. This structure right here would be something like when I go home, I'll see my dog kind of sentence. You're not going to get that particular syntax if you have a relative pronoun, because a relative pronoun, that, who, or which, are going to follow right in front of it. It's going to be the word, the antecedent that it's describing. So it's going to be the man that was here, or the woman who came by, or the dog which, the car which, so on. So that antecedent is usually found right in front of it. Not 100% of the time, but usually. So once again, these are your words, relative pronouns, that, who, and which. Who and whom is only the difference of nominative case and the objective case, which has no bearing on the form of the other, that and the which. You're going to use the same spelling for either the nominative or the objective case. But they do appear in different cases, so you have to analyze the sentence to see whether the that was used as a subject or the object within that clause. Here, this chart is showing you whether that word can refer to a person or an object. The real rule is that the that needs to be separated from the who and the which. And this is the kind of old, I say old in the sense that it's the traditional way that we learned maybe many decades ago. And it's the way it has been used for probably centuries, but a lot of changes have happened in grammar, and these changes are being reflected in the tests and in grammar books, in the newer books, so that it gets a little confusing. But the traditional way is to say that is it begins a restrictive clause. The who and the which begins a non-restrictive clause, and so they should be used differently. And so there is a distinction there. I don't really want to get into the restrictive and non-restrictive because that's a whole discussion. Probably take several videos just to talk about it. For here, let's just remember that can refer to the person or the object. So it could be a man that, or it could be a car that. Okay, except that people don't really like to say the doctor that or the nurse that. They don't like to say the that with the person. It just sounds better if you say the who right after it, and so people opt for that. And so you may do that for the person. The who cannot be used with the objects, however. For objects, you can only use the which, and the which cannot be used with people. You cannot say the doctor which or the lawyer which. Let's look at a sentence that includes relative pronoun. It was a silence that could be heard is your sentence. And here, what we need to do is isolate the dependent clause. This is the dependent clause, as I call it, or the subordinate clause. So this relative pronoun is your subordinating conjunction, basically, in this case. So we don't really call it that. We call it the relative pronoun, but it does serve the function of connecting the main clause here, which is a regular sentence that can stand by itself, and connects it to this, the dependent clause, which cannot stand by itself because it includes this connective. The connective has to be attached to a main sentence somehow. Okay, so it was a silence. All right, that's a sentence. That could be heard is a sentence because there's a subject and verb and possibly an object in there. So it has a subject and predicate, which makes it a complete sentence. In this case, that is your subject, and then could be heard would be your verb. So subject, verb, 1 line, 2 lines I would put. And what is the that? The that is a pronoun that refers to a certain antecedent, and the antecedent in this case is silence. So if you had to choose, say, is versus are in this case, you would say, well, silence is singular. The that is the same as the silence, so we need the singular verb is. Okay, if that were the case. Let's look at the second sentence there. He saw the man who was invisible. So the word who begins the clause, so we'll mark it from there. Where does it end? Who was invisible is the end of that dependent clause. He saw the man is a complete sentence. That's your main clause. So in the dependent clause, you have who was invisible, subject who, and then was, linking verb, and then you have your predicate adjective, invisible, who was. And why is that was and not were? Well, that must mean that the who is singular. And why would that be singular? Because the who is the man that's there. So he saw a man, and that man was invisible. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense. It's kind of ironic, paradoxical, okay, poetic, possibly. Like the poem, I saw a man on the stairs who wasn't there. I forget how that goes, but it makes interesting poetry. Let's look at the next sentence. You have she was the woman whom I heard. All right, so here is the beginning of the dependent clause. And here, the tricky part is, what is the sentence within that subordinate clause? Whom I heard. Well, the verb we know is the heard. Who's doing the hearing? It's not the whom, it's the I doing the hearing. So there's my subject, there's my verb. What did I hear, or whom did I hear? I heard this woman, and this woman is the object of this clause, and that's why we need that whom instead of a who. Although we're still talking about the same person, if I change this sentence and said who, she is the woman, let's say, who cried last night. Let me get that S in there, last night. If it was like this, then I need a who, because within this clause, this is the subject and this is the verb. But in the original sentence here, it's I heard her. So if you want to say him or her in that position because it's the object, you need to get the whom in there. The next page shows us the compound relative pronouns. So there are other pronouns that can be used as relative pronouns, and words like whoever, whosoever, whomever, whichever. I think the meanings are pretty obvious to you, so I wouldn't go into it. Whoever does whatever is, you know what, let me make a better sentence for you. Whoever comes to the meeting will receive a certificate. All right, so let's say that was my sentence. Whoever comes to the meeting. And then I said will receive. Will receive a certificate. Yes, my writing is terrible, and it's not just the pen. My writing is terrible on paper too. Whoever comes to the meeting will receive a certificate. Here we have a verb, will receive. That's your main verb. Who's going to do this receiving? It's actually this whole clause here. It's this person, whoever comes to the meeting, and we consider that whole clause to be the subject of will receive. And so this whoever doesn't need an antecedent. It includes an antecedent. The book we're following is English Made Simple by Arthur Waldhorn.